it's a great to be back in California this time of year. It's a great time of year to come. I started out in the Red River Valley of North Dakota, not far from the geographical center of the continent, a very flat, isolated place. And the first hint for me of something interesting beyond that straight 360-degree line was the British invasion in 1965. And by the time I went off to the University of North Dakota, it was with the idea of becoming a poet like Thomas McGrath. McGrath had grown up in North Dakota. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He studied at Oxford. He spent some time in Los Angeles. He was called before the House Committee on Un-American Activities and blacklisted. He was my hero. But I soon found that I lacked the courage for the occupation of poetry. But I kept a hand in, and at one point I wrote a poem about returning to writing poetry in which I claimed to recognize McGrath's footprints in the snow. And I printed the poem up into this little book, and I sent him a copy. And he responded. And that was that, until shortly after he died, I was looking through his last book of poems, and I found this. So when I finished at the university, I moved to the nearest city of Minneapolis and began illustrating small press books. And in those days, there were little presses springing up all over the place because there were these little pockets of money that people could get to print books. And for somebody like me that was willing to work for next to nothing, there was all kinds of work. And I was using pen and ink early on and beginning to print, but print pretty roughly. And then Gerald Lang moved to town. He had studied with Walter Hamady and was very good with the finer points of printing, typography, and book design. And at one point, and he was very generous with what he knew. And at one point, Jerry looked me in the eye and he said, "I taught you everything you know." And he laughed that Jerry Lang laugh. We did a few projects together. At this point, I was still using pen and ink, and I was using a rapidograph pen. And I found myself using the 000, the finest point possible, and painstakingly trying to control the space between each dot. I had that precision thing. And then one day I found this book on the remainder table of a local bookstore with wood engravings by Barry Moser. And I came to understand that these things were printed from blocks that were made the same height as type. And since they were end grain blocks, you could go in any direction and there was all this potential for precision. So I ordered a book, found where I could get some tools. I ordered some tools and a few blocks, and I began engraving pretty roughly. And then we have an annual book fair in the Twin Cities, and back in those days it was called the Great Midwestern Book Fair. And I saw this book on a table there, and it was $35, which was a lot of money for me at the time, but I just had to have it because of the light hitting that rug and the fact that the artist was adding a little bit of detail to that color block just fascinated me. His name was Howard Phipps. He was an Englishman, and the book was printed by the Whitington Press in England. I'd heard the old High Bridge was going to be demolished, a 100-year-old bridge, and I went down there the day of demolition and took a bunch of photographs. And from the photographs, I came up with a series of color wood engravings that evoked a walk around the bridge on the day of demolition. And alternating with the images were stories derived from newspaper articles that were written during the bridge's construction. So as you're taking this last walk around, you're reading about the construction until finally the bridge is finished, it weathers its first storm, and down it goes. So I printed the book at the Minnesota Center for Book Arts in its first year. And so it wasn't really organized yet. There weren't a lot of people around. So I had my own corner. I had my own press. I was all set up in that corner. And they were my first color wood engravings, so I was kind of making it up as I went. And I had them all taped to the wall, and every time I'd print another color, I'd tape the latest version on there. And I came into work one morning, and there was this tall man standing there in my corner. And I went up, I said, hello, and he said, good morning, with an English accent. It was John Randle of the Whitington Press. And we got to talking, and I think I was kind of fishing for an illustration job, but John said, well, maybe one of these days you can write something for Matrix, the journal. I'm sure you guys are familiar with Matrix, the Whitington Press's annual journal. So I've written for Matrix quite a bit over the years, and John has become something of a bookish godfather to me, and I think a lot of people. It seems like every season John's got somebody new under his wing. Here he is at Whitington Press, and I just love the way that they just let the jungle enter into the press through the roof. They don't bother. So Gerald Lang suggested that I send a review copy of Highbridge to fine print in California. And I thought, yeah, sure, why not? So I sent them a copy, and it was reviewed by a man named Robert Pack Browning. It was a great review. And almost immediately, I get this letter from somebody named Peter Koch, and he says, hey, you want to make a trade? And I said, sure. So that's how I was introduced to Peter the first time. And Will Powers at that time was printing fine press, I'm pretty sure. But this predates the Highbridge period of time for sure. But later on, when Will and Cheryl Miller moved to the Twin Cities, Will knew my work because of books going through fine print. It seems like you guys really kind of passed them around and looked at them and really paid some attention to them, which was pretty cool. And here is Will up on the frozen surface of White Bear Lake in Minnesota with a fellow Ampersander examining a printed sheet. We decided to print a book out there one year on ice for some reason. And I think Cheryl Miller's in that coat somewhere. So my next book was called Farmers, and there was this conference in New York. This was, I guess it'd be the late 80s. And Betty Bright was there representing the Minnesota Center for Book Arts, and she was showing slides. And David Esselmont was there from Wales, from the Gregynog Press in Wales, and he was looking for an American to illustrate Whitman's Civil War poems. And he saw these slides from Farmers, and he thought, those are the big American skies we need for our Whitman. And I happened to be there too. I think I tagged along with the MCBA contingent somehow, and David found me and described the project. They wanted illustrations of Whitman's poems, like dead soldiers and horses crossing rivers and field hospitals, and he asked if I'd come to Wales to do the work. And I thought about it, and dead bodies, field hospitals, horses crossing rivers, it sounded really hard. I didn't have a passport or anything, so I said, I don't think so. And the next day I ran into Steve Clay from Granary Books, who also started out in Minnesota, and I told him what had happened, and Steve said, the Gregynog Press asked you to illustrate a book, and you said no. Are you out of your mind? I'd never heard of the Gregynog Press. So the next day I found Dave, and I said, yeah, okay, I'll do it. And so I went over there. And growing up in northeastern North Dakota, I thought I knew what cold was until I spent a winter in Wales. So this is the Gregynog Hall in Powys, mid-Wales, where the Davies sisters started an arts and crafts center later in the 19th century, which was where the Gregynog Press began. And the press wound up being one of the key presses in the British private press movement at the turn of the 20th century, but I didn't know anything about any of that when I went over there, which is why I first said no, because I had no idea. And David's sort of signature book at that point that got him the job at Gregynog, he had grown up in Newcastle upon Tyne, where Thomas Bewick was from, and there's a Bewick museum there, and so David was able to get access to the Bewick blocks and printed this book. So as I was crossing the Atlantic, the Gulf War broke out. So when I got into Gatwick Airport, there were guys with machine guns in the terminal, and it was a bit unnerving. But I managed to find my way to Wales. And when I got there, David wasn't quite ready, so I had a little time on my hands. And I ended up spending 6 months listening to the BBC accounts of the Gulf War while I was working on these Whitman poems for the Civil War, so it was kind of interesting. But I had a little extra time, so I decided to issue a sortie of my own. The Gregynog Hall is a cement building. It's not Tudor. It's painted to look like a Tudor building. They called it mock Tudor. And in the central column of the building there's a stairway that goes up. And under the stairs there's a vault, and in the vault they had all of the old Gregynog books in their special bindings. And David gave me a key to the vault. I fell for Agnes Miller Parker right away. I just loved her compositions and the way that she made textures. She'd do cross-hatching and then dots kind of at the same time, these little marks. And some of that texture, particularly the texture stuff, started finding its way into the Whitman images. The American Civil War was the first major human event to be photographed. And when I was looking at these photographs of soldiers, I was struck by sort of the innocent look in their eyes. And I mean, naturally, a young soldier going off to war, there's that innocence there, but I suspect a lot of them have never seen a camera before either. So I think if it were just up to me, I would have probably just done portraits of soldiers, but I was hired to do illustrations of poetry, so I did some. This was called Look Down, Fair Moon. And it was really interesting to work with another printer for a change. I'd never really done that before. And so we talked a lot about what we wanted to do. And in this case, we really wanted those bodies to be really deep black. So first we printed the key block like with reflex blue, just a straight blue, and then we printed it in black to get some real depth. And then the blue of the sky was actually mixed with opaque white, so where that overprints the key block, you get the moonlight off of the ground. And then the bodies themselves, there's a yellow block and a purple block, and the purple block ends where the shadow begins, so it kind of delineated the bottom of the body as well. So I was starting to think, with David's help actually, starting to think a lot more about the changes that take place in layerings of colors than I had up to that point. And it was really a lot of fun. It was fun printing together. And all the other artists that had lived there when the Davy sisters were there lived and worked there. So there were all these echoes of all these other people around. Like that Albion Press was from the old press. Blair Hughes Stanton was another one in the vault that kind of caught my attention. And again, it was kind of a line quality thing. This was a bit later that I started kind of using his lines a little bit. This is a book that I did on an old printer named Emerson Wooling, who was in his 90s when I interviewed him and took pictures of his shop and stuff. He started printing when he was 12, and he printed until he was 104. And the type here is actually Blado Italic, which is what Hughes Stanton was using here, so I was kind of soaking it all in. That kind of says it all for Emerson. He was a hobby printer the whole time. It was just purely for pleasure. So I get a call from Jerry one day, and he says, why don't you come down to Los Angeles? There's this guy here who'll put an exhibition up of your work, and you could teach a workshop. And so, yeah, sure, I came down to Los Angeles and met some interesting people. Robin Price was there. She'd been working with Jerry for a while, and she'd actually just finished a book at that point called The Dooley Poems, which, I mean, it's a monoprint that she was doing for the cover, which isn't something that Jerry would do, but as I looked through the book, I could just see Jerry all over the place. I think she's another one that Jerry probably taught most everything she knew at that point. And Richard Wagner showed up at the exhibit, and he was just telling me he'd never met a wood engraver before, and I'm not sure I had either. But I think about that time, Richard was probably just starting to think about zebra noise. It must have been pretty early on. And we certainly have that precision thing in common. And we both do fish on occasion. And with this particular image, I was kind of interested in that squiggly line at the bottom because it reminded me of how the trade engravers, when it was an industry, they would, generally speaking, I think, they would have a drawing already done on the block, and their job was just to engrave around that drawing. And I think that's what Richard was kind of thinking there a little bit. I know it's what I was thinking about here. It's kind of a fun way to work. I really like connecting with history, the history of printing and engraving and all that stuff. I think about that a lot. So one day the librarian at the Grolier Club in New York came across a couple of boxes of blocks in the library, and realized that they were the engravings that Rudolf Ruzicka had cut for their publication called New York, celebrating the city at the turn of the 20th century. And they decided that they should have somebody reprint these, so they sent them to me, and I got to spend about 6 months with them. And I'd never printed anybody else's blocks before, which was really fun. Here you can see on the back of one where he was testing a tool that he'd just sharpened. And here he'd used one of those plugs. They used to have these tapered wooden plugs, and if they wanted to fix a mistake, they'd drill a hole, and they'd cut off this plug, and somehow they'd make it flush with the surface. I have no idea how they did it, and I was really surprised when I printed this that there was no circle. So I started printing this image first, and I think I was 2 or 3 press runs into it when I realized I was going to have to start over, because Ruzicka was using the opaque white trick, the same thing like that Look Down Fair Moon. They were printing this brown and then overprinting this gray mixed with opaque white, making a third color. So until I realized that, it was a bit of a puzzle, but once I figured that out, things went pretty well. I'd never matched anybody else's colors before, and I have that red-green thing where you can't see a cardinal in a leafy tree. And so I figured if I started with a bright white sheet, I'd get a little bit of wiggle room in there color-wise. And the interesting thing was I think it also made my printing of the images feel more contemporary, just on account of that brighter color of paper. It's not a color. So the club asked me if I'd be interested in producing a sequel, a celebration of the city at the turn of the 21st century. And of course I said, you bet I would. But there was a catch. They weren't going to commit to the project until they were certain they were going to get their money back. So I had to make a prospectus for a book that didn't exist. And they flew me out to New York, and they put me up for a few nights, so I was able to take some pictures. And I brought them back to Wisconsin, and I kind of fell back on that hybrid formula. I just kind of made a sequential series of images of my wandering through the city, and so I at least had that. And the other problem was I was going to be using reduction cuts, so in order to print an image on the prospectus, I also had to figure out where it would fall in this book that didn't exist. So I had to figure which side of the sheet and just how to work that out. Plus, for me, things really develop as the work progresses, and I didn't know where these things were going to go because I hadn't really gotten much done yet. So I threw just about everything in there. There you can see a Blair Hughes Stanton wonky line hanging off that building. And I didn't actually end up using that much at all, but I kind of couched my bets with that little thing in the upper left-hand corner, that sort of breaking up of the rectangle up there, which was just enough to get away with it, I think. This is one of the spreads, and that guy in the yellow jacket there is, in fact, David Esselmont, and he's about to get on a train going in the wrong direction. And he's got a great story, but I'm not going to even try and tell his stories. He's too good at it. But I think my favorite part of this image is that wall on the left-hand side there, because there's some really great things happening there, and the black managed to leave it alone. So David and I wound up doing another book together called Ink on the Elbow. And it was 5 years of email correspondence between the two of us. And I was pretty amazed at how readily we were willing to butcher the language to make this leap into our bright new world. I mean, everything all of a sudden was dot this, slash that, abbreviations. I mean, and all of a sudden correspondence was disposable. And so we decided to do a book where we very carefully edited so it's really readable. And so that was the main reason for the text. And we were sending JPEGs back and forth, you know, and pretty much we were talking about projects we were working on. And one of the problems with the kind of books that we print is that you've got to figure on a lot of waste because you're going to lose a lot of sheets. And so you end up with all these stacks of expensive, worthless paper laying around. And this was a way to get rid of some of that, too, because it's kind of a leaf book. We put leaves in there from the projects we were working on. And we each bound half of the edition. This was one of the books that I bound, and I sort of took a paste paper pasting lesson from David at one point. And behind these paste paper lines is actually a press sheet from the Wooling book. And this is one of David's special bindings. So you can see the wild and crazy kind of paste paper things that David was doing. My main contribution to the book visually was an image of the Esselmont spread over in Wales. That building on the right-hand side, that gray building, was his studio that he built intentionally 2 feet longer than my studio back in Wisconsin. And you can see my shadow taking the photograph that I worked from. And the full image is actually probably close to 4 feet wide. It was like joined in the middle in these 2 fold-outs. And this was David's reply. This is a linoleum cut of his that's in the book. It's his shadow taking a picture of me in my tractor. So, John Randle was planning to print a book of wood engravings by John O'Connor. And it was late in O'Connor's life, and he was in the hospital. And so John decided to go ahead and print the colophon page ahead of time and take it in the hospital so O'Connor could initial the colophon pages. And initially, the images were all going to be black and white. And John likes to use different paper for the first and last sections of a book. He does that quite a bit. And in this case, he was going to use this bright blue Bugra paper because he expected that the images would be black and white. But O'Connor's dying wish was that his son come to Whitington Press and add as much color to these images as he possibly could. So they were brayering color and all this stuff, which was fine with Randle, but at that point, he didn't think he could use the bright blue paper anymore. So his solution was he kept the one blue leaf and he wrote a postscript to the colophon describing the significance of that blue leaf. And it's kind of a subtle example, but John is great. He's great at just kind of putting the ball in play and letting things develop and not pushing too much. And I think that's really been an important lesson for me. I did one other old printer book. Ernest Morgan was his name. And he was down in North Carolina. I went down there with my camera and tape recorder and recorded his stories and came back with some photographs. And I was going to do this portrait of him, and I did a drawing of the photograph and sent it to Ernest. And he wrote back and he said, my sister doesn't like that one. Could you use this one instead? And I just couldn't do it. It just wasn't going. And so I went back to the original idea, and I started engraving, and it just wasn't going anywhere. Because I knew he didn't want me to do it, and I just felt terrible about even attempting it. And so I ended up putting the block on a shelf, and I shelved the whole project for a couple of years. And then Ernest passes away, and now I'm feeling really bad because I never got to the book. And one day I came across the block, and I thought, maybe I should just try this one more time. And it was like cutting butter. In 2 days it was done. It was just amazing how it went. And so I figured that was Ernest saying, okay, if you're not going to print the book unless you you use that image, go ahead and use it. So I went ahead and printed the book and wrote about it in Matrix. And one of the great things about writing in Matrix, you get a copy of Matrix, but a few months later, out of the blue, you get this package with this bundle of off-prints of your article and this wonderful little binding. It's just a really sweet touch. I have a dear friend who lives in California, who loves rivers, as do I. Thank you. I was living in a warehouse when I first started printing with a bunch of other young artists, and we were across the street from a paper company, and they had this loading dock, and they had these big wire bins where they'd throw their scraps in there, so we'd go over there after dark and steal our paper. And at one point, they actually blocked it off so we couldn't get in there anymore. And every now and then I do business with Anchor Paper still. They have an annex now where you can get smaller quantities, and every now and then I tell somebody over there that story, and they laugh, you know, oh yeah, we remember when that happened. So. So, yeah, I guess after the New York book, for me that book was like the ultimate project. I mean, I couldn't imagine anything greater than that. And I took this sudden turn into sort of natural history, and I got interested in, I did a book on mayflies, a study of mayflies, where I collected specimens and studied them and made engravings of them and sent them on to an entomologist who sent back the entomology, and that started to form a text. And that book took about 4 years. And then I did a Silva study of trees where Benjamin Verhoeven and I collected specimens of all the different trees in our property and made specimen prints from the different species. And then I spent 7 years working on a book on Lake Pepin on the Mississippi River, and they're all sort of natural history-related things. But the thing about it is that, like I was talking a little bit about when David and I were printing together, how we were starting to think about layering colors in different ways. Well, the Silva project was huge with that because I was starting to make my own blocks and really understand a lot about that and layering colors and everything. And with this last book, it's almost been more like painting because I start out with an idea and I just keep overprinting and overprinting till things get right. I guess more and more the process is kind of taking over. But now, at the end of this project, I feel like I'm at a real turning point, and that whole process that's been evolving since Highbridge, really, I think I've come to a peak with that. And now I'm right now I'm working on it's a children's book, really, and we're starting with found objects that we picked up along the Mississippi, and we're making type-high blocks out of them, things like driftwood and limestone and bricks and things like that. And I have a bunch of people I'm working with in different ways, so I'm kind of moved off in a different direction right now. But it's like as Peter, it just keeps going. And Carol, you just keep going from book to book. I always say the next book's the most important one. You know, that's the one you got to be thinking about. In a nutshell. I've pretty much been a Vandercook person most of the time. I have a Heidelberg cylinder press that the last 10, 15 years I used quite a bit, but I think I'm going to get rid of that because I don't think I need it anymore. It's more than I need. I've had 2 or 3 platen presses over the years, and I've never had any luck with them. Just never had any luck with them at all. I've never, at Gregynog, I was doing all my proofing on that Albion. In fact, we had it tied to a wall because it would take so much pull to get an impression from some of those big blocks. But that's really the only hand press experience I've had. For me, the computer has been huge in that regard. I mean, I've got that color blindness thing. So, and with the project I just finished, I got a full-framed sensor camera, so it takes pictures that have really big files. So I'm able to get them onto the computer and really zoom in. And I actually use the color sampler thing to get a sense of what I'm looking at. And when I first started out, my idea anyway was to try and think the four-color process through in my head. You know, red, yellow, blue, and black. But I found pretty quickly that I really needed gray in there. And once I started using gray, and then I started finding out things like if I printed red on top of gray, I could get a black. And so that gray has been really important. The other important thing has been, like, until I went to Gregynog, I was printing all of the colors first and then overprinting the key block, which is really kind of awkward in a lot of ways. David went the other way around. He'd print the key block and then just use tint bases over the color block, over the key block. So more and more I have been fooling around with that, adding more opaque, less opaque to obscure things underneath it more or less. And color-wise, oh, I had another good thing to say there and I forgot what it was. It's gone. Thanks. I've always been a big cloud person. This project we're working on now, cottonwood trees, big trees. They have very big bark. We've been printing the backside of the cottonwood bark. And so there are all these striations of different kinds of fibers and things in there, and they're making the most spectacular skies you'll ever see. So now they're getting a little more extract than that, but yeah, that was quite a exercise in clouds, that one. It's Lake Pepin. That point that you see in the distance is called Point No Point, and they called it that because when the steamboats would go by, it's kind of a rounded thing, so they'd never get there. It wasn't meant to be, but everybody that sees that says Dolly, you know. But no, I didn't have that in mind at all. No, it's kind of started out, I was looking at a lot of 19th century European specimen prints. And the fish in those things are almost always in the landscape somehow. They're like floating. And so all my fish in this book are floating in the sky, and so they just ended up floating. And actually there's another, on the back side of the left-hand muscles, if you turn that over in the book, you see the insides of the muscles, and you see the upstream view from the same place. With something like this, you spend so much time engraving. You're thinking about it all that time, and every crazy thing that comes to your mind, you have to at least consider it. You know.